Hello there. Welcome to this third of our debates on Birmingham's post-COVID-19 recovery. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. This series of debates is organised by Colmore BID in association with Reach Media. My name is Mike Best from Colmore BID. And for those who don't know, Colmore BID is one of 5 improvement districts in the city centre and 12 in Birmingham. We were established in 2009 and now in our third 5-year term, delivering services to levy payers, improving the public realm and running events like Colmore Food Festival. Currently, we're working closely with our public and third sector partners in dealing with this crisis and planning for recovery. And today's topic was chosen as rough sleeping and our street community as an issue that the BID's been actively involved with for many years, and is indeed my area of responsibility as chair of our Safe and Sound working group. Most of you will be familiar with our street operations team. The response to the crisis was very much around the term everyone in to get the rough sleeping community off the streets. And some said that it could be an opportunity to end rough sleeping altogether. But as we're coming out of the other side, we do wonder whether we'll see a return to an undesirable normal for our street communities. So that's what this debate this morning is about. And at that point, I'll hand over to Mark Reeves, our chair. Thank you.
Well, morning all, and thank you, Mike. Welcome to everyone to this debate. Thank you very much for making the time for this. I'd like to introduce our panel who are joining us today, and then I'll be posing a question to each of them to get the ball rolling. So, as well as Mike, we're very lucky to have the chief executives of 2 of Birmingham's most significant homelessness charities. We have Carly Jones, chief exec of Cypher Fireside, and Jean Templeton, chief exec of St Basil's. We also have Councillor Sharon Thompson, who's cabinet member for of Homes and Neighbourhoods for Birmingham City Council. And from West Midlands Police, we have Superintendent Gareth Morris and Sarah Tambling, who is chief inspector in the local policing force for homelessness. So we have a very wide perspective on what is a very important issue. And I'm going to invite each of them to get the ball rolling by just thinking about and sharing with us, in terms of their work with homelessness over the past 2 or 3 months, what's been the impact? What have you seen affecting your work and the people that you work with? And what are your hopes for the recovery and maybe your fears? You know, what are going to be the challenges that you think need to be top of the agenda as Birmingham moves into the recovery phase of this? And I'm going to start with Jean. But Jean, I wonder if you can also, as well as answering that, just set the scene for us, please, just so that we really do know what we're talking about. Just give us some of the basic data and the facts, maybe a definition of homelessness, particularly in this city.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and hi everybody. Yeah, it's an interesting one because we use terms kind of interchangeably around homelessness and rough sleeping, and Mike's introduction was very much focused on the engagement with rough sleeping, and clearly during lockdown in particular, the national focus has been very much on rough sleeping. But I think it's sort of important to put that in context, that is really the tiny part of a very, very large iceberg around homelessness. And particularly in this city, I think this city has really good integrated processes, responses, partnership working, which has meant that rough sleeping, you know, has largely been managed, and when it rises, you know, there's been a coordinated approach to it. But that's very much been government attention during this period as well. Concerns obviously for public health issues and people at risk of spreading too. But there's other homelessness. There's during lockdown, there are thousands of families nationally and in this city as well who are in temporary accommodation, who are homeless, who are seen as statutorily homeless, and they've had to cope with the situation during lockdown in temporary accommodation with no real home of their own. There's young people. St Basil's specifically works with young people, generally aged 16 to 25, And every year we'll see 3,000 or so of those who will come to the youth hub and then be rehoused in this city, the youngest city in the country. So the experience is different for them as well. And then obviously Carly will talk about those that are over 25 as well. So I think it's seeing it in the round, Mark. And when people talk about homelessness, it is much wider than those that we see on the streets. In terms of St Basil's and young people, it's interesting. We are very fortunate that there is a youth pathway in the city, and there are a number of providers that are commissioned to ensure that young people do not have to be on the streets to get the support they need, and the accommodation and the resources and the friendship. So the youth hub is multi-agency, and it works out of Digbeth, and as I say, some 3,000 young people come through there each year. So our work during lockdown has been interesting. So Basil's ourselves, we've had 722 young people in our accommodation during this period, and over 500 of those in Birmingham. And it's been ensuring that those young people are safe, that they have the resources. 20% of them have been self-isolating at different times. But the actual presentations, those that have presented as homeless, have gone down by 50%. Not really surprised, because families and everyone else are trying to hold together and keep people in and keep their young people in. In terms of our hopes and fears, our fear is that unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, is going to rise exponentially, both in relation to some of the employers, particularly in hospitality and retail and other sectors. Young people are going to be affected. So we're fearful of high youth unemployment. So those that are trying to get into employment will struggle, and those that are in employment may well lose. And also, because of that, those that have access to banker mum and dad and families that they can stay with probably be all right, at least for some time. But there's many young people and many families under pressure in the city where that won't be the case. And so we are concerned that there will be a spill out there.
Jean, thank you very much for setting the scene. That's really useful. Very interested in what you're saying about the numbers of referrals during this period. Carly, I wonder what your experience has been in terms of referrals, and with the I think the flooding that you had last week, clearly a massive challenge there. So you might want to touch on that. But what's your response to your hopes and fears of the future, and what's been the experience over the past couple of months?
Hi Mark, hi everybody. Yeah, it's been a really interesting time for Cypher Fireside, because we, in terms of our service, we're previously seeing around 140 to 160 people each day in terms of the day centre provision. We have the commission provision around prevention, but we also do some of the crisis relief work in the rough sleeper space as well. So obviously having to close for face-to-face services had a massive impact on us, and we had to make a very rapid shift into sort of telephone-based support, doing safe and well checks with people, and really, the partnership working, I think, throughout this will be a reflection that I would make as being quite extraordinary, and the amount I think in terms of some hopes to continue that momentum would be one of them, and that has worked.
Carly, it seems
very
you might be having a few
some great learning. Oh, sorry, I think my internet connection might be a bit unstable. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's better. Carry on.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry. Okay, so last week, just reminding you of that 140 to 160 people a day figure, that is now 30 people maximum coming through the service every day. So it is in last week, 50 people a day, people maximum coming through the service have changed. Outpouring of support, if you'll pardon the pun there, which really was quite amazing. So that's been significant for us. I think some of my concerns moving forward would be around the fact that we have a lot of people potentially now that are facing arrears or have started to get themselves into trouble, and they're being hidden by lockdown. And obviously, as we come out of lockdown, we think we're going to see quite an increased number of people that we wouldn't have previously seen coming through our doors that need support.
Carly, I think we've lost you again.
Sarah, have you got me back?
Yes, I think so. It's very erratic. Carry on.
How much did you miss? Because I carried on talking.
You're talking about the risk of increase in demand post-lockdown, particularly as people in arrears are facing the crunch there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really big concern for us, because obviously there will be a lot of people that hadn't previously touched our service and the type of service that we offer, and we're concerned that now, as Jean said, in terms of youth unemployment, but also in the adult space, which is where we are predominantly, I think we're quite worried about that. And I think the other two areas of concern for me are around the people that were accommodated in response to a public health emergency, who might not normally be entitled to that support, and how we continue to sustain an offer for those individuals. And then finally, just around mental health, we've seen some deterioration in the mental health of some of our clients that we've been doing safe and well checks with, and I think the sort of burden that's then placed on mental health services, where people are experiencing increased anxiety coming out of lockdown, would also be something that I think is important to note.
Thank you, Carly. Sharon, I'm going to turn to you, because we started to touch on, I think Carly mentioned a couple of the measures that have been put in over the past couple of months in the statutory side of provision. Perhaps you can articulate from Birmingham City Council's point of view what's been done and what will carry on being done, and maybe particularly on government support.
I mean, in terms of the response to homelessness for COVID-19 across the city, the whole of the sort of direction of travel that sits within, kind of partly to do with what my remit is about how we're going to respond as a city, how we're all going to pull together, and working with all the different agencies in order to do that. So one of the clear things I think we have to be clear on is what was we responding to. And we was clear in Birmingham, all the partners, Carly, Jean, everybody else that's been involved, that before we actually hit the UK, we was already thinking, what are we going to do when it comes to the homelessness community? Because we didn't want high infection rates. And we've been quite fortunate that we've only had, I think, 2, which hasn't been bad considering the size of the homelessness crisis in Birmingham and across the country. I've been involved in a lot of discussions with government and with different partners, particularly around what we need to do. And I think we was all very clear that we wanted to get as many people in off the streets as possible, and to support them, not just in the pandemic, because this is a public health crisis. It was about saving them from actual infection. But we wanted them, once they were indoors, to support them, to move them on to the next phase of their lives. We've supported over 500 individuals across the city collectively as a response to COVID-19. We've had a lot more inquiries. It's been over 1,000. And with that, we've had a number of people who've had no recourse to public fund, no access to public fund. And when the government said everybody in, that meant those cohort of people could also be supported and they could be in. So that was really good for us. There's been a lot of discussion across the country because the everybody in policy comes to an end towards the end of June, which puts a question mark over the support of those people because the legislation wasn't changed. In Birmingham, we've made the decision that we will continue to support them for as long as we can under that guise. So we are looking at that, and there's a recovery plan in place. We did use a commercial hotel to help us with the additional people that was becoming homeless. And that hotel has now been decommissioned. So all of the rough sleepers that we brought in at that period of time have been offered more long-term or permanent accommodation. I know one guy was over the moon that he had a bungalow and a proper tenancy. So it's been a real change of life for some people. But I do have a lot of anxieties, and we do need to be clear. And in my mind, this is very clear. we have not seen the effects of the COVID crisis when it comes to housing and homelessness. And as Carly has touched on, those people in the eviction ban will still have their rent accounts clocking up rent. If they're not supported in how do we make sure we manage that, payment plans and things like that, there's going to be an issue. And we've been lobbying the government to put a fund aside to support those people so that when that eviction ban gets lifted, particularly those in the private rented sector, that they don't end up in a difficult position. There's a number of asks that we had, and we decided as a region, because I chair the elected members group across the region, that with the work that Jean's doing, with the plan on the page that everybody knows about, that we was going to look at the live data of what's happening on homelessness. And we've put together a positioning document, which Jean's probably better equipped to talk about than I am in terms of the detail, but that went to government to say, this is what we need in Birmingham moving forward. So we are asking for a bit of an amnesty when it comes to those with no recourse to public funds. We are saying we need to up the ante when it comes to building houses, and the government need to make it more easier because people will be stuck in temporary accommodation. We are saying investment into domestic abuse, domestic violence services, because we're seeing people who are, there's an increase of domestic abuse, but also we know that how we do things and how we look at things is very different. There's going to be a need for more probably singles properties, because some people are just falling out of relationships because they're spending too much time together, not because of domestic abuse. So I think there's a whole range of things, and we continue to lobby the government on all of it.
Thank you, Sharon. I think what's coming out already is it feels like this is a pivotal moment when I guess we've all got decisions to make. We've got, and those decisions are going to have a massive impact on people affected by homelessness in the future, and lots of things are due to change. I wonder if I can turn to Mike now to reflect on the BID's perspective on homelessness. Obviously, you put it centre stage in this very debate, so Mike, it'd be great to hear more from you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. I mean, interesting just to hear what the three speakers already have said, and obviously we work closely with all of them in the work that we do as the BID. But I mean, it's interesting. The thing that Jean said right at the top of the debate was, I mean, rough sleeping is only one small aspect, and I think there's a diagram that Shelter have got showing kind of the iceberg, effectively, that is homelessness, and we only see rough sleeping, and from the BID perspective, and also those of us working in the city centre, you know, the street community is only a small fraction of the rough sleeping community as well. So I think we understand that that's only a partial picture that we see. But I think the BIDs over the years have recognised that homelessness and rough sleeping is something that presents itself in our city centres. Particularly Birmingham has had a growing problem in recent years, although it is being well tackled by all the agencies involved, but we know that ultimately it's about government policy and government funding. But I think what we've been keen to do is, from probably a decade ago, there would have been people involved in the BIDs and in the business community that would want to see people moved on out of the area, and our approach definitely is quite the opposite. It's about helping people in need, it's about signposting them to the services that they need, and what we'd like to see is more collaboration in the business community. So as a BID, our levy payers are paying for services, and arguably, do they need a street operations team that is helping rough sleepers or people presenting on our streets to find the services they need? I think actually they do. I think business people have a moral duty to do something about what's happening in their areas, and that's why the BID's involved in it. So I think there are a couple of things really that we want to try and achieve. One is, day to day, we've got the street operations team out there, and people will be familiar with John Joe and Aaron and the rest of the team who are out there day in, day out, meeting regular people that they know well. And I was just looking at the numbers that we collect. And for a 3-month period last year, between April and June, we had about 700 reported incidents, the majority of which were low-level ASB, begging, some violence, drug, alcohol problems, and the like. This year, same period, we've had about 100, 150 incidents. So, the number of people we're encountering on the streets in the crisis is dramatically reduced, clearly because there aren't people working in the city centre. Therefore, there's not as much to be gained by trying to beg, steal and borrow. So, you know, that's what we've seen change. But I share the concerns of everyone who's spoken so far, in that we've not really seen the impact of the crisis yet. As people gradually come back into the city centre, even in the last 2 weeks, and with the reopening of non-essential shops last week, we've started to see the street community returning, and I think we'll see the numbers start to spike again. So our concern is, you know, can we do something? Can we get better interagency working? Because I think what the crisis has shown is that we've worked better together in recent months than we have for many years before, and that's across the charity collaboration. That's with the police, that's with the city council, that's with Trident outreach services as well. So I think if we can work better together, as we have been doing, that bodes quite well. And the other thing I'm keen to do is make sure we collaborate between the businesses, because we've got hundreds of businesses in the city centre, many, like the larger businesses, already heavily involved in the homelessness task force. Lorna Gavin, for instance, from Gowling, obviously is on the task force with Jean. So there's a lot of commitment from big businesses, but we'd like to access a lot of smaller businesses who do have business leaders, but also members of their staff who want to do more. And I think the more we can signpost them to how they can help, what they can do, how they can help fund through change into action, housing first, etc., all the things that are being done by the authorities, then that's, I think, the role the BID can play.
Thank you, Mike. And I think we'll certainly get into trying to explore that question of what hopefully people in the audience today, what they can do and what they should be doing to support the efforts of everyone here. So let's turn to West Midlands Police now, and to you first, Sarah. Clearly, we've already painted a picture of a very sort of changing geography or dynamic over the past 2 or 3 months. What's been your experience from WMP's point of view?
Thanks, Mark. Yes, it's been an interesting few months, really. As soon as the lockdown commenced, really, as you've already described and as others have articulated, the change in the landscape in the city centre of Birmingham was phenomenal. So the street community was still there, but were more visible than ever, and their vulnerabilities were more visible than ever. Our reaction to it was to work far more closely with partners, as Mike's already described, so with the BID colleagues across the city, so Colmore included, but with their other street operations teams as well, any street-based wardens, to make sure that we're sharing information and working together on a daily basis. And that involved a very quick development of a very close working partnership with Trident as well, to make sure that we can support those that are vulnerable in city centre to access the services that they need to understand what was available to them, and prevent them from becoming even more vulnerable. I think the challenges that we faced is that sort of public perception, because the street community were far more visible. The public perceived that it was worse than ever. It wasn't. It was actually, you know, very quickly tackled and very quickly resolved, that people were becoming housed, and we've seen some amazing success stories, as other colleagues on the panel have described today, and similar pictures playing out across the Force area as well, in other town and city centres as well, in Coventry and Walsall and Wolverhampton. So really, really positive steps towards housing, supporting that most vulnerable community. One of our biggest challenges, and a fear for me as we go forward, is preventing the further exploitation of that community. Now, we've seen drug dealers come into the city centre and prey upon the community and really attempt to exploit them and get them into, you know, worse situations. And that community, that sort of criminal activity has become more visible than ever as well. And we have a specific team that are working on criminal investigations in relation to that. But my concern is that will continue to be an issue, especially as already it's been articulated, concerns around unemployment, about people turning to crime to raise funds. And that criminal activity in the city centre has been a particular issue. I'm really hopeful that our partnership working with the BIDs, with Trident, with the outreach teams, with all of the partners that we work with under the Homelessness Partnership Board, will lead to us be able to tackle that crime. To be able to work together to share information and to be able to be one great big team, really, to support this wider community. And I think that the work that we've very quickly put in place at the start of lockdown, that now continues on a daily basis to do that, will continue, and is a really, really positive step in that sort of partnership working arena. So some real successes there, but yes, I've got similar concerns to partners around the table.
Thank you, Sarah. Gareth, similarly from West Midlands Police, do you foresee problems growing out of control? Is there a risk that the confluence of more unemployment, financial problems, as well as the issues that Sarah's explained, what does the force need to contribute to tackling these problems, and does it have what it needs?
Thanks, Mark. So I suppose first of all, by way of an introduction, I had quite considerable involvement with this subject when I was inspector in the city centre, going back about 4 or 5 years now. And initially at that time, the police were quite disconnected from partners, and we were pursuing probably a bit of a cyclical approach to enforcement, where we were locking people up for subsistence offending on the street. They were spending a night in the cells, or they were getting a small fine and straight back out. And of course, very counterproductive to find someone that's in a subsistence lifestyle anyway. So we put a foot on the ball there, really, and looked at what we're seeking to achieve around using enforcement, because in essence, our toolbox, is limited in that in terms of how we address and solve some of the issues of vulnerability here. So I'd go on to say that I've been out the loop for a few years, so I'm 2 months back into role, and Sarah is the force lead for homelessness and the chief inspector within Birmingham. So her knowledge surpasses mine at the moment. But I'll do my best to give my sort of stance on the subject matter and some of my concerns, and where I'm looking to work with Sarah and support Sarah to continue to deliver on some of the partnership areas. So as I've just mentioned there, for me, enforcement is very much a considered step as part of a wider picture. The Vagrancy Act and the legislation that can be applied to begging is historic. It dates back to the Napoleonic era, so its application needs to be considered in light of modern society, and it's nowhere near a solution in isolation. So for me, it's very much about support provision first, about working with partners, about making sure the correct information sharing is in place, and about relationships with the third sector, with the council, with the outreach teams, and with businesses. Because actually the dialogue from business has really matured, in my opinion, and it's really understood. And to be fair to Colmore, I would say they were sort of class leaders actually in picking up this agenda and this issue back a few years ago. Because initially the direction and the push I was having from business leaders and business individuals was, can't we run around some of these individuals up? Can't we go out with a van first thing in the morning and just clear the streets? Well, it's kind of abduction, that really. And but joking aside, I do recognise there's a massive impact on business, and we can't lose sight of that amongst this issue of vulnerability. That there's equally antisocial behaviour, and there are other challenges that are presented by elements of the street community. And I suppose I touch on one of the biggest reflections I had about this subject matter, in that the street community is very, very diverse. You've got some very vulnerable individuals in very vulnerable circumstances, right the way through to some individuals that perhaps will purport to be homeless and are not in fact, and they're using it as an opportunity to accrue wealth, at the times to exploit other members of the street community, to peddle drugs. There's a wide variety of individuals that present to us on the streets, and no one solution is obviously is the sole answer. But for me, enforcement is absolutely a part of and concurrent with support activity, and often used to try and help drive some of that positive engagement. So if we're going to use behaviour orders or criminal sanctions, then they absolutely should be used to try and support and drive positive engagement. If we've gone through all those mechanisms first and they've failed, so we're there to try and work with partners, not supplant them or undermine them. In terms of what we've seen, I think Sarah's articulated that quite well. We have some significant challenges around COVID, not least of some of the challenges with the community themselves and the pandemic, but equally, as I'm sure most people will be aware, the pandemic has played out with some challenges in the criminal justice system, where a number of court cases were postponed or held, and we've now got a significant backlog we're trying to work through. But it also led to probably some triaging of certain offences by the Crown Prosecution Service. And this isn't a criticism, I'm not passing blame. This was a natural consequence of lockdown and some of the challenges we all had to navigate. But what it did lead to is a challenge when even needing to use enforcement against members of the street community. That we managed to have some quick conversations with CPS and the courts, and thankfully that did seem to improve. But that was a significant challenge. The everybody in, I think Sharon, as a councillor I've worked with before, again, very knowledgeable individual on this topic, and Sarah both allude to the everybody in campaign, extremely successful. So I'll just touch on my sort of fears and concerns and how businesses can help, which, Mark, is probably what you wanted me to talk about in the first instance. So sorry if I've gone on a bit. So I think we have lost some of the view of vulnerability. Whilst our perspective on some, the everybody in, the opportunity to engage and offer some really superb support to individuals has been excellent. And Sharon's given an overview of some of the numbers of individuals that have gone through, as have other panel members. I think equally the reduction in footfall in the city has also impacted, I think, some of the third sector and some of the support that food kitchens would have had, that Cypher would have had, and that other agencies may have had. They will be better equipped to comment on that than I. The higher unemployment is something that definitely concerns me, and what particularly concerns me at the moment are domestic abuse cases. So we've seen a significant rise in reported domestic abuse, and I draw a heavy red line under reported domestic abuse because it's underreported, as we know. But in locking everyone in, we've obviously seen people that are part of abusive relationships, in detrimental circumstances. We've seen a 20% rise across the west of Birmingham, and that includes the city centre, although the city centre's figures can't be taken into account really here because of the numbers of residents. But broadly across Birmingham, we've seen a 20% rise in domestic abuse cases. How that will play out amongst the homeless communities is probably still to be determined. And I think, as Councillor Thompson referred to as well, the eviction ban is something that really concerns me about what that hidden vulnerability looks like that's waiting in the wings for when some of the government rules and regulations are redacted. I'm really pleased to hear about the stance that the council are taking in response to the everybody in and the continuation. I'd be really keen to sort of understand with the council what that looks like and try and support as best as possible. But I think what we're starting to see now actually is, as I said, the street community is diverse and made up of true vulnerability, purported vulnerability, those that would visit harm on others on the streets, some very pleasant individuals in horrific circumstances, and those who actually, have deliberately relocated sometimes for criminality. So it's a huge plethora of individuals that we see. Vulnerability always needs to be taken into account first, of course, but we saw, as Sarah said, a significant reduction in individuals in the city begging. That's predominantly due to supply of funds. If you've got less foot traffic, you've got less people that will give money. And interestingly, other parts of the region saw begging where they hadn't before, particularly around supermarkets and so forth, where some of the foot traffic had perhaps refocused. And now the city's starting to reopen. That's dissipating those areas, and we're seeing a return to the streets of Birmingham. So I suppose the three elements from me really around the businesses and where the businesses, or four elements really, where the businesses can support. The first is engagement and understanding the wider challenges, because I'm really keen that we keep away from this mantra that's just around cleansing the streets and taking that sort of very, very crude approach, that we understand and educate ourselves and those in our communities about the complexities and the vulnerability that sits within this issue. So that's point number one. Point number two is some of the mentoring and employment support that potentially businesses can supply and support some of the charities and third sector. So when we've got individuals that, and as the council has alluded to, the number of individuals that we've helped, in terms of then looking at next steps, at employment, at mentoring, at support, at interview training and so forth, it's where businesses can add value there. Service provision, as Mike has commented on, the street teams are superb within the city. They really work well with both the police and the wider public sector partners and third sector partners. The investment in there is excellent, and that's something that, again, I think I'd like to revisit around some of the community safety accreditation work that was looked at in the market some years ago, where we can look at some of the powers that they have and potentially even offer elements of policing powers to support. That's a delicate conversation to explore, but one I want to look at to see if we can maximise their efforts at all. And the fourth element is something that Colmore in particular have really picked up, and I know they've supported a number of charities, and that is charitable support. So where we have got supported charities by some of the bids and by businesses, where they can invest in those teams supporting street communities, that for me is something I'm really keen to push and really keen to encourage. I think it's one of the best ways that businesses can support the city of Birmingham and its challenges. That's an overview from me, and I hope I haven't spoken too much.
Thanks, Gareth. That's really useful and a really interesting insight into your perspective. Just to remind the audience here, you are invited to ask questions. Click on the chat bubble that you can see on your screen, and Chris will help me surface some of those questions, and I will put them to the panel as and when time allows. And actually, at 12 o'clock, we'll move very specifically into more Q&A. More of a Q&A session if the questions are there. So don't hesitate to put your points and views across. I'd like to sort of drill down into some of the issues that we've already touched upon, and maybe ask Sharon to respond to some of what you've heard about the. I guess I labelled it a pivotal moment earlier, where the ground has changed. It feels like the issue is inevitably going to get larger. The challenge is going to get larger. What would you like to see in terms of the people on this call in the panel? How can we ensure that Birmingham is keeping up with the pace of that challenge?
Okay, so the first thing that I do want to say is I do want to say a big thank you actually to not just the people on the panel, but actually everybody in the partnership, because I get to see what's happening across the country as well as just what's in Birmingham. And Birmingham at the moment, its response to COVID-19 and homelessness, particularly rough sleepers, is being held up as an exemplar by the government and many different cities. Other cities have been in a situation where they've had hundreds left on the streets when we've been down to 10, 7, it's gone back up to 17. And homelessness is a moving number. I think we need to continue with the strength of our partnership, but I keep hearing people talk about the recovery phase of COVID-19, which is fine in most areas. I don't actually want to recover when it comes to homelessness and COVID-19. I want us to learn from what we've picked up, and I want us to remodel how we're doing things so that we can get things better and get things right and get us back into that prevention space. Because one of the things is that numbers, the government talks about the rough sleeping as if that's one static number, and if they move, then that's it cracks. Well, actually, no, it's a moving beast, and there's more numbers that come on board as time goes on. So I think we need to continue with the learning that we've got. I think we need to have more, we need to restart conversations, particularly publicly, because what I've seen, which Gareth did touch on, is that actually there was a lot of rough sleepers who previously were reluctant to engage with services, but because there was less people about to buy them that Greggs or buy them a cup of tea, they did start to engage because it was more about survival, and then they came in. So we need to look at where's the best place for our community sector or our volunteers and those that do the feeds. Where's the best place for that energy to be channeled? I think that's one thing. I think we do need to continue collectively to lobby the government, and that's on the basis of we can only do what we can with the resources that we've got. So ultimately, financially, you know, the council spent a lot of money on COVID, so that's, we've got a deficit. How much are we going to be able to put into homelessness? And I do think that it's also strengthening the work that we're doing as a region, because the reality of it is homelessness, people move from local authority area to local authority area. So we have to look at the challenges there. But ultimately, I think we do need to have honest conversations about how we're having the communication widely. And we need to have honest conversations about where's the best place to put all of our resources and rethink some of that. Huge challenges with no recourse to public funds, but some of it's out of our domain because it's government policy. So I do think it's just about how do we more smartly support different things. How do we support Carly at Cypher? And how do we channel resources into this so that those people that are in love with Cypher and trust Cypher, who don't trust the council, but actually we are making sure that we're better using the resources. And again, the stuff around housing first, again, I'm a fan of housing first, but it's not the answer. It's one of a number of answers. It's just about how we utilise resources. Biggest thing for me is housing associations, private rented sector, the councils across the region, those willing to put their properties in, because if we're talking about reducing homelessness, we need the properties that are willing to put the properties in to have a difficult group sometimes occupying their tenancies and not doing it in a ghettoised way. So you've got everybody in one particular area. We need to make sure that people are integrated properly. So I think those are my key asks and would wants in terms of moving forward. But mainly, we need to change the narrative of looking at this as recovery, because we don't want to go back to normal. We want to go forward and make things better.
Thank you, Sharon. Maybe for Jean and Carly, you know, that there has been what could be a positive resetting of some attitudes, maybe of some homeless people, their relationship with some agencies, and the engagement that you see from various partners. What would you like to see come out of this that could make more of a long-term point? I think Sharon made a very good point of saying that this isn't a matter of getting us back to normal, because actually normal wasn't good enough in the first place. So what would you like to see? Jean, perhaps you could go into this.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, 100% agree with Sharon. We do not want to go back to what things were before. And I think I learned a new term recently, and I'm using it all the time now, so forgive me. But it's called the liminal zone. Okay, the liminal zone. I heard somebody say, oh, looked it up, and apparently it's that period when all the old rules don't apply anymore, but you haven't quite made up the new ones yet. So you are in this really good space where actually you can think about how you want the new rules to be and how they can work better for everyone. And I kind of think that's the space that we're in at the minute. And I just think there is so much capacity, and I see on the chat as well, you know, somebody has made a point around, you know, feeding and how that's organised and how it's kept safe. I mean, I think we do not want people to have to come onto the streets for their food, for their company, for their safety, for a sense of belonging, for the next steps. We do not want them to have to be in the worst possible situation before they can get what they need: a home, the support you need, you know, enough income to kind of carry on your life. We don't want any of that. And if we rush back to that, that's what we'll get, because we'll just default back to the old ways of doing things. So I think, you know, Sharon talked about the regional work, and what we've been trying to do across the region is take that look at the systemic issues and really look at, you know, how do we plan for what we want to achieve, not just what we want to avoid? How do we have a focus on prevention by design, designing out homelessness? And that's what we've been looking at. And the paper that Sharon talked about that went to government was very much about that. You know, Sarah talked about, you know, sort of preventing exploitation. This is a real opportunity to disrupt exploitation, to tackle the underlying issues of poverty and violence and everything else, which bring people out and get into difficult situations. So we know it's going to be really, really difficult, but I think we should resist just defaulting back to where we were. And I think we should continue the partnership. We should really extract the learning, really extract what's better for people. Because certainly we've seen young people, maybe we rush too much to rescue sometimes. And, you know, we talk about doing with instead of doing for, and certainly not doing to. But what we've seen during this period is that we've kept young people safe, but we've adapted the way we work with them. And it's made, just like Sharon was saying about people have engaged who wouldn't have engaged before. So they have looked at issues, they have engaged, they have looked at learning and programs that are online. They have read a letter that's come through that say they might be in difficulty, and if they don't sort out their rent or where there might be a problem. Now, before that might have been giving it to someone else to sort out. So I do think that we need to also be asking all of the people that we're supporting, what has been different for you? What have been the different triggers for you during this period? And how can we keep those going so that we don't go back to this rescue mode and that kind of doing everything for, that we see this as proper partnership. We see it as proper partnership with the people that have vulnerabilities that we need to support. We see it as proper partnership with the different sectors, particularly the business sector. And Gareth, absolutely. The work that we've done regionally with the business sector has been around keeping people in jobs in the first place, so that when they get into difficulty, we don't just look at performance issues and sharpen our pencil and they go out. Creating pathways into jobs for those that would struggle and wouldn't necessarily meet lots of the initial recruitment criteria. And then also supporting the organisations that you can trust and do meet quality standards. And not just thinking, because everybody thinks, we can sort homelessness. Actually, if it was that easy, we'd have done it a long while ago. It's complex. People's lives are complex. And all of the underpinning elements around their relationships, around their job, around their health, around their home, that's the things that keep them safe and keep them in. So if we can ensure that we look at those issues, we kind of call them the four legs of the table, healthy relationships, employment or training, a means of earning your income, a roof over your head, a home, and also, good health. If we can underpin those things, then we are far more likely to keep people in. And if we turn our attention to how we do that collectively, then I think we're in a better position for a much better future. And it is about, how do we do it intentionally, perpetually? It's not a one-off thing. It's got to be constant.
Thank you, Jean. I know, Gareth, you were really keen to come in and talk about the question that was posed by Paul Street, I think, which was the maybe I'm using journalistic exaggeration, but the sort of saviour syndrome of people swooping in with goods and services and food, but that being a sticking plaster. Gareth, you wanted to say something on that.
Thanks, Mark. So there's two questions that have been posed on the group. One by Paul Street, which is around that, and the second, which is around Hattie D'Souza, which is around some of the entrenched individuals. So I'll pick up on both those points if that's okay. I know BVFC are looking at some work around the charitable sector and those that come in, as you say, sort of intention of helping and supporting those on the street. That plays out in quite a sort of complex way for the police. So, as I've already said, that the homeless community and the street community are complex, as are some of the individuals that purport to assist, because some do not visit the homeless community with the intent to support. Some are there to look at dealing drugs. Some are there to try and encourage the homeless community to deal drugs, or indeed to look at other mechanisms of exploitation. And we know that from some of the engagements we've had. So during COVID, and you may have seen some of the footage that's circulating on social media, there's examples of our officers engaging with individuals who are stating they're there to try and provide food to the homeless, but are refusing to provide which charity they're attached to. And this was during initial, early phases of lockdown where it was quite restrictive. So we've got quite a few issues there to navigate. Now, we did have an event going back a few years now where we endeavoured to try and bring together, with the council support, to bring together some of the third sector and soup kitchens and those that wanted to go out and support, to look at how we registered, endorsed, and checked individuals to make sure that we were supporting the right individuals, giving support to those on the street. And it's really difficult to manage and to administer, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, because ultimately, people can walk out of Sainsbury's and give someone food or give someone a sandwich or otherwise. How do you stop that kind of work happening? But some of the more organised approaches onto the street, we wanted to try and collaborate as much as possible, because again, these are information sources of people that have engaged with some of the individuals we're trying to help, support, or indeed at times enforce against. So I think revisiting some of that work is important, and I think Sarah may come in because I think it's been picked up by BVSC. So I'll defer to Sarah in a second on that. The other question on here was from Hattie D'Souza, I think, and I think it's been commented on by Tara as well, which is around the 27 people who categorically will not go inside. And that number, as the council has already commented on, does vary. But yes, we do get people that refuse to be supported and refuse to be helped. And so what then? And that for me is where we can play a delicate but supportive role. So as I've already said, that we have to look at this from different angles and different perspectives. And we're talking overridingly about this as being an aspect of vulnerability and individual vulnerability, which is absolutely where we should first look at this. But there are some knock-on effects from some of these behaviours as well, and we've talked about, the use of the drug paraphernalia around the city, the aggressive instances of begging, sometimes where it's gone to robbery or intimidation or abuse, and that there are different ways that we need to look at this. So what we're fundamentally talking about is individuals that are often trapped through reasons of substance addiction, wider circumstance, financial, domestic circumstance, in a cycle of substance abuse and street lifestyle, which we know is incredibly detrimental. We know that that the average lifespan of individuals living on the street is 46, 47. So it's that moral question for us about where we take almost a bit of a big brother effort to try and resolve some of this, to try and support people moving away from a subsistence lifestyle. And it's partly what drove some of the efforts around alternative giving, when if we look back a little bit. But the police can play a role here, and it's a really delicate role, and how we tread into this arena has to be very, very considered, and it has to be agreed really with partners, because we can use things like positive prohibitions or positive requirements in some of the orders that we can introduce. So we can require people to try and attend treatment. We have seen examples where we've had entrenched individuals in the past who've refused categorically to engage with agencies, where we have been able to either use the power of court orders to mandate some engagement, or indeed result in short custodial sentences where we've seen repetitive behaviour that's offered an avenue to have an in to support the individual. And don't get me wrong, morally it's one to really explore carefully, because we're not talking about people that are ripping off the state, highline organised criminality, although there are aspects of organised criminality on the street. But overridingly, what we see is a picture of subsistence offending, hand-to-mouth, begging, low-level theft, or otherwise to fund either food or substance addiction. That's predominantly what we see on the street. Sorry, so that's kind of my view as an overarching point.
Thank you, Gareth. We've got a few more questions coming in that I'll get to. I did want to bring Carly in from the point of view of charity working with adult homeless people. Given the discussion we've had around lots of other individuals and organisations with the very, very best of intentions, wanting desperately to help, what's the message from Cypher about how people can help you do what you do day in, day out, and actually actually move the dial a bit on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of this, the key sort of point really is what Sharon picked up on, is how do we use that resource that we've got to best effect? And I think the role for Cypher as well in terms of our space is, we have a city centre location where we do see a lot of the kind of most complex and challenging individuals, and sometimes people that have been excluded from everywhere else and sort of end up with us. So I think it is about looking at what the coordination is in terms of what's on offer. And just to kind of pick up a little bit on the point about food and stuff like that, I just think I totally understand the goodwill and the intention, but to just highlight a point that, the largest prosecution for modern slavery in European history saw its first victims coming through farmer soup run. So I think when we have this conversation, we've just got to be aware of the risks and what's going on for people potentially when we're sort of running these kinds of activities. And I suppose where Cypher does come in is that, we've got more than, I think we're about 36 years in, longer, of working with very vulnerable people, of providing practical support and crisis relief, as well as doing the prevention piece. So, I think it's also using us as a good resource as well, and our offer, which is often that we can have conversations that sometimes other agencies aren't able to, and there's a whole wraparound there that exists where I'm sure Mike hopefully would agree that Colmore BID have used Cypher very effectively in terms of engaging with street community and making sure that there is that differentiation between there's a nefarious element that exists in Birmingham city centre that is not homelessness, and it shouldn't be associated with homelessness. And so what the BID have done very effectively, I think, is work in partnership with us to make sure that those very vulnerable people are being channelled in the right direction.
Thanks, Carly. We're coming to the end of the first hour, and we will continue with some questions if the panelists are happy to, and if the questions come in. We do have a question from Mike Leonard to all panelists, but I suspect, Sharon, you're probably best placed to answer this, which is Mike's asking, the government's announced significant funding and there may be more to come as the consequences of rapidly rising unemployment become clear. Has Birmingham put forward a bid, and what would our priorities be to increase capacity to deal with homelessness, provide more homes and access to employment? So is Birmingham at the front of the queue when it comes to that kind of support? Sharon?
Birmingham has been very much in the front of the queue when it comes to asking for support from the government. We've been in direct conversations, like I said, with Louise Casey and civil servants, and I think even others across the region, not just the council, putting across what we actually need. We was quite clear at the beginning that we wanted them to understand what our plan was or what it is we were trying to achieve, and ask what the funding was. But with all things, when it comes to funding, I mean, Birmingham spent £272 million responding to COVID-19 across the board. And despite the fact the government said we was all going to get the money back, we've only had 70 million. So that's quite a significant shortfall. Homelessness, we have had allocations, and we do work with our commissioned services to help deliver some of that. So sometimes council recognise it's not the best person to deliver, but we do go to our expertise out there. There's lots of things that I think with homelessness, we have to be clear that the issues around homelessness is not just around bricks and mortar. There's so many different fractions that are involved. Now, we will continue to lobby for house building. And even though the council is one of the biggest house builders in the country, we still have significant issues around house building. The government said that they are going to put forward, I think it's 6,000 properties for rough sleepers, but you have to take into consideration 15,000 rough sleepers were brought in. So the numbers don't actually always tally up. I'm not going to criticise and say they haven't made a good start, because I think they have made a good start, but there's still so much more to be done. So we do prioritise. I think, Jean, we in this city, we prioritised young people. And there was one point where, when it came to the funding that we get from the government's rough sleepers initiative, young people was taken out of that from the government's perspective, and Birmingham decided to continue to fund that. So we always do. And I think we have to be clear, the council's approach to homelessness is that it is a city response, and we work in collaboration. So what our partners tell us is what we take on board, and that's where collectively we'll talk about where does the money get spent, but continuously lobbying. But we have to get into the prevention space. It's okay spending money on crisis, which helps us in the here and now, but we need to help people to stop falling into crisis in the first place, which is a very different conversation. And actually, homelessness prevention is about systemic change in policies locally and nationally. So it's not all about money, it's actually about policy change that pushes people into crisis in the first place. And it's also about investing in prevention work. So at the moment, the money we get from the government is almost always about homelessness crisis work. We don't get the money for homelessness prevention. That is the space Birmingham wants to be in.
Thank you, Sharon.
And I have to say, I can't see the questions in the chat. My chat box isn't working, so I'm just basing it on what you've asked me.
I think that's a really interesting theme to start to put to all the other panelists as we start to move to wrap up. But we will obviously try and answer more questions. And maybe go to Mike. Taking Sharon's challenge that says at this point it's our opportunity and our requirement to move from sticking plaster crisis response through to actually making a change that's going to start to deal with what causes homelessness and the policies and the environment that allow it to get to the point where in the Colmore BID area we see people sleeping on the street, but by that point, to an extent, it's a bit too late. So, Mike, how can you and your members actually start to inform the debate that Sharon's challenges us to get involved in there?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think where the space that we've tried to occupy, because I fully accept that on this panel I'm the least expert of all of you. Is I think there's a real role here for the business community to have a voice in this debate, because I can well see government will turn around to local authorities and even to the third sector and to a certain extent to the police that, yes, you're asking us for this, you're asking us for that, it's usually around more money. And I think there is a role here for the business community to add that voice to government to say, we do need some systemic change here. To go back to Jean's point about designing out homelessness, I mean, we're very supportive of the document that was produced by business in the community in partnership with the combined authority, and there are some really practical measures in there which businesses can adopt, and we're certainly looking to promote it widely. We were hoping to arrange an event this year, but I'm afraid the crisis has got in the way of it, but we'll certainly look to do that as soon as we're able to safely. But a couple of things really. I think the thing that struck us as a business community, and in talking about it within Colmore BID, is clearly homelessness is first and foremost about having a home. So Sharon was saying building more homes, dealing with having the supply of suitable accommodation for people is paramount. But as you get more into the issue of homelessness, you understand it's about so much more. And we've heard a little bit today about issues around domestic abuse, about drug dependency. We know there are lots of mental health issues involved as well. And actually, one of the big things about how do you tackle homelessness long term is about work. And it just seems to me that the business community has got a role here, and we've certainly been working with Carly around their Work It Out programme. I know Jean and St Basil's do a huge amount. Trident also have a number of programmes around getting people back into work. And so we'd really like to find opportunities for the business community to participate, either by providing for placements or limited amounts of work experience, which again would be working closely with partners, because I know that talking to a lot of businesses, their concern is, right, you want me to give some experience to someone who's on the streets. How safe is that going to be for our colleagues and for our premises? But there are all sorts of ways in which that could be done. I was talking to somebody recently about setting up a kind of pop-up office, so you could actually set up business in a staged environment, but give people some work experience during the course of that. So you're not necessarily giving people access to business premises where there might be confidential information, but there's all sorts of things that can be done by the business community working together with all of the agencies to start to make a difference. So I think if we can help at the work end, we can't necessarily do anything about housing accommodation, but as a business community, and particularly one in the city centre, I think there's a huge amount there. And then just very briefly, I mean, the other issue that started to crop up and we're starting to address in the BID is modern slavery, which again, you think of all the blue chip companies in the business area and you think, well, that's got nothing to do with us. But when you start to think about all the areas in which modern slavery exists around support industries and catering, cleaning, construction, so on and so forth, it's probably a lot closer than we all imagine. So a network's been established quite recently that we're involved in. And again, there's things we can do there to make sure that our suppliers are conforming with regulations and are being policed and are being checked on. So I think there's a huge amount that we can do in support of all that the other agencies are doing as a business community.
Mike. Sarah, can I move to you? And this might be a bit of a tricky question to put at the police, because if the issue is moving from managing the crisis of homelessness to more of the causes and the factors that lead to it in the first place, how can you make an impact on that beyond your day-to-day crisis management role, I guess?
Thanks, Mark. That's a really interesting question, actually, and it is a challenging one. But I think that we have got a significant role to play in the criminal justice space as well. I think all too often we attend incidents in home addresses, particularly domestic incidents, where we separate families because of something that's just occurred, without thinking of the implications as to what might happen next. And I think that we've got some education to do across our force and across our resources to think about how we can prevent people from becoming homeless because of the actions that we've taken to resolve a crisis, to resolve a crime scene, for example. So I think that we've got a significant part to play in that space. And it's certainly something that I've started to have conversations with internally around. And even if you think about people who are coming out of prison and our offender management teams and those that we work with to rehabilitate, are we absolutely on the front foot in terms of preventing them from becoming homeless, and what role can the police play within that? And equally, those who we see not just following crisis incidents or domestic related incidents potentially, but those who we see through the custody process, who might not feel able to return to family because they're ashamed of what they may have done. So I just think we've got significant stages in the interactions that we have with people to give some real consideration to our actions resulting in somebody putting themselves into a vulnerable position and at risk of becoming homeless. So we've got some significant conversations to have, and I've started conversations with our Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, who are really behind that as well, actually. And they've appointed a new policy lead in relation to this. So I can see that we've got some real positive steps to take forward.
Thank you, Sarah. That's fascinating to understand those touch points that you have that can actually have a direct impact on this. Jean, I'm going to sort of throw the issue to you. Now St Basil's is literally all about preventing youth homelessness, and it has been for more than 40 years. Do you feel like you're banging your head on the wall, or are you optimistic that this is the opportunity to really push the agenda further in that direction?
I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a real kind of fine line between we talk about ending homelessness, ending something, and preventing. Ending something sounds as though it will be a point in time you will reach and it will no longer happen. And the trouble then is, if you, and don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not against ending homelessness. It'd be great not to have homelessness. But if you see it like that, then you can think you could take your eye off the ball after that. And so we've seen, particularly now, huge resource going into getting people off the streets, tremendous. 6,000 homes, although 15,000, great contribution. But we're in danger of seeing, right, that's it, job done, and off we go. And the thing about prevention, it is perpetual. It has to be intentional and perpetual, and you keep going all the time. So St Basil's, yes, has been here since the late 60s now. Mark, it's like, a long time. And do I think some of our board at the time would have thought, we'll have done our job properly if we're not needed anymore. And I think you hear that quite, and I've seen Carly nodding that there is that sense. That's not how I see it. How I see it is, if you continue to do your job, we will not have, in the youngest city in the country, we will not have under 25s on the street, or if we do, they'll be off really, really quickly, because we'll have a whole framework and a whole system which ensures that we do prevent. And prevention, we talk about primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. Primary prevention is you can stop the homelessness happening in the first place. So as Sarah was saying, if there's a different way of dealing with a particular situation, if you have a planned pathway out of the criminal justice system, if you have the care system that ensures that young people have accommodation that helps underpin their choices in life, their education or their work or whatever, if you ensure those happen, that's primary prevention. They never go near homelessness. Secondary is actually, they are at risk and they are going to be homeless. And so you need something that will deal with that, wrap around and ensure that they do not have to experience that homelessness. And then that kind of third layer that we see is that when the young people that come to us and other providers in this city that really work well with them and look at their strengths and look at their talents and try to build on those, not that kind of deficit of what's your problem, what's wrong, how can we put it right. It's all about building up their strengths, their talents, their skills, their opportunities, then what you're doing is you're preventing them or their families becoming homeless again. So we have to weave that prevention, that designing piece into everything that we do, whoever we are. And I'm perpetually optimistic about that, to be honest, Mark. I get really wound up. Can't believe that, but I do get wound up when it is seen sometimes as that, okay, like it's all about rough sleeping, and if we get them off the streets quickly, you know, and then we'll put some resource in and job done. Because it's not like that at all. And that's why it takes all of us. It's bigger than all of us. It is about jobs. It is about good health. It is about support. It is about housing. It is about a compassionate society that, as Gareth and Sarah said, thinks about, why is this person on the street? Why have they got to this position? You know, what have they been through in order to get there? And then how can we work with that and help them to move on?
Jean, thank you. I think that is probably the perfect way to wrap up today's session that has covered a lot of territory, but I think it's actually focused us on a lot of dimensions of the challenges that we have ahead. And I've certainly learnt a lot. So I'd like to thank all the panellists for your extraordinary contributions, and Colmore BID for putting this together and inviting me to host. I'm very privileged to be part of it. And Chris from Colmore BID, I think you can wrap up, maybe give a bit of a plug to maybe some future events.
Yes. Thanks so much. Thanks, Mark. And thanks everyone else for joining us today, both the panellists and attendees and participants as well. It's, like we said, it's a very important discussion, this was, and it was a topic that came out quite highly when we polled people about potential debates. It's what people want to know about and sort of get access to the decision makers and people that work on the crisis in Birmingham and further afield as well. So thank you again. If you didn't catch the first half of the session, I'll be editing the video later today, and that'll be up on YouTube on catch up as well, because I know there's a few people that have messaged saying they've had to dip out. So yeah, you'll be able to get this on our YouTube channel. But yeah, so this was the third of our panel debates, and our final session is next week, where we're looking at transport within the city, looking at how it has changed over recent months due to the lockdown, and also plans for the future as well. No doubt we'll be talking about the clean air policy that's coming into Birmingham, as well as other schemes around cycling and public transport as well. So we've got quite a good session for that. If you've got any other questions for the panel or anything else, please do drop me an email, and we'll put some resources up on the Colmore BID website as well afterwards, just in case you've missed anything or would like to share information around your own business or see how you can support as well. But yeah, I'd just like to take another moment to say thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully see everyone next week for the next session. Thanks so much.